Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this Insight Publications seminar addressing the personal response task for Year 11 EAL. My name's Jess. I work at Insight Publications. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Bunurong people and also the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional owners of the lands we're coming to you from today. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And as I said, welcome to our first seminar of the year. Well, it's our second. We had the English one yesterday, and today is personal responses task in the classroom for EAL students, Year 11 EAL students. Now, presentation today will be delivered by Avril Good and Lachlan Whitley. Hello, welcome to you both. They're both EAL teachers and are also currently writing for our upcoming EAL Year 12 title, which addresses the new study design for EAL. And just some quick housekeeping before we start. Don't forget that at the end of the presentation, we've got 20 minutes for Q&A. So if you think of a question during the seminar, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. I'll be monitoring the questions as we go, and then I will be asking them of Avril and Lachlan at the end. So if you have questions, pop them in there, we'll record them. And there are lots of you here, so we may not get to all of them, but we'll try to get to as many as we can. So I think we're about ready to start. So Avril and Lachlan, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jessica. So we both wanted to start today just by introducing ourselves and our contexts a little bit more. So I teach at St Albans Secondary College. I'm the assessment and curriculum coordinator there. St Albans is a really large school, and we've got a really big EAL cohort. We have EAL classes at every year level, at least 2 or 3. We're really lucky that our classes here are capped at 15 students. And at junior year levels that we have classes streamed on ability for EAL students. We've got a really diverse cohort of students. We have over 50 different language backgrounds at the school. And yeah, I see that as a real positive in the context of our school.
And I'm Lachlan, and I work at Carey Baptist Grammar School. At the school, I work in the research and innovation team, and I also, of course, take EAL classes. Most of our students are international students who come across from mainland China. We have separate EAL classes from year 10 up, and they have a support class from year 9 down to year 7. And we're working on a program in the junior school at the moment. So with that, I'm going to just quickly run through what we're doing in today's presentation. So first, we wanted to introduce the personal response for EAL and talk through some of the ways that it might be a little bit different to how it runs in English. We'll talk through how to identify and develop connections with the text that you've selected. And Avril and I will both talk a little bit about the texts that we're using at our schools. Avril's then going to run through some classroom activities that you could pick up and use in your classes in the coming weeks. We'll then go through some ideas that you might like to use for assessment before finishing up with a discussion of how you might want to start thinking of building a bridge between this task, the personal response, and more traditional analytical writing, which they'll do in Unit 2. Okay, so I'm going to start us off with this big topic, big question, what is the personal response? So taking from the actual study design, I've got a couple of quotes just to sort of narrow our focus. So students are required to identify personal connections with the story. And this is really the core of the outcome, is that they need to make these personal connections with the text that you've chosen. Then they need to discuss the ideas and values presented by the authors through character, setting, and plot. And this is the familiar territory. So this is a reminder that we're still looking at texts in very similar ways to how we will have previously. So still looking at all those big elements of text. Students are also discussing the ways that a text can present human experiences. And then of course that bringing in the response resonating with their own memories. And then that final piece about comparing the cultural, social, and historical values embedded in a text with their own. And that's actually where I've started the year. And I'll talk a little bit more on that later. So I think sometimes it's also useful to consider what is not the personal response. So it's not a standard text response essay, as we will have done previously and will do in Unit 2. It's not just adding first person pronouns to one of those standard essays. It isn't the comparison task, which was part of the study design that's still at Year 12 this year, and formerly Year 11 last year and before. It's not a book review or a film review. And it's not just personal reflection without close reference to the text. That close reference to the text is still very much part of this task. Moving into some of the key differences between English and EAL, one of them is really this idea that you're allowed to use extracts from the text. And I see this as something that could really benefit those of you who have a blended English EAL classroom. Your whole class is doing quite a long text, which might not be as accessible to the student in your class, whether or not that is just a full EAL class or a blended class. You're able to then use an extract for the student. So for example, the text I'm doing is The Tale of Princess Kaguya, a Studio Ghibli film, an anime. And if I had a student, which I don't this year, but if I had a student who wasn't capable of studying the full film, I might have just focused in on one scene and used that scene as the basis for them to meet the outcome and create their personal response with that one scene. I know in a previous school they're using, that I worked at previously, they're using Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's collection of short stories, The Thing Around Your Neck. If I had a student who I wanted to use just an extract or a whole class, I would maybe only use one story from that collection, such as the title story, with a focus on how that story focuses on a yearning for home and talk about how we all have yearnings for things in our life and trying to create some connection there. So that is one difference between English and EAL, is that ability to just use extracts. Additionally, in the outcome statement, students in EAL are required to identify and not necessarily to explore. That isn't to say that you can't encourage students to move more into that higher level thinking area, but they're not required to meet the outcome. To give you a bit of an idea of what the difference of those might be, I've got some verbs here just to sort of show the different levels of thinking. So identifying might only require labeling, recognizing, quoting, describing and characterizing, while you can see explore is getting more towards that analytical space. So a little bit of a more difficult task that you can still very much push for your students, but it's not required for the outcome. And then finally, one of the other differences is that your assessment for the personal response doesn't need to be an extended piece of writing. It can take the form of a note form summary. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the assessment section of today's presentation. I'm going to now introduce our next section, which is about identifying and developing connections with the selected text. So I'm going to run through some of the key elements of text that you might be developing connections with. So characters, this is what I'm actually starting with my class tomorrow. We're going to be looking at a focus on characters and how we might connect with some of their motivations, some of their behaviors, and of course the character traits. You might be making connections with the setting in your text, including some of those features. Of course, having a think about some of the important turning points, the conflicts, the tensions that exist within the text and how these might create connections. Certainly the ideas, including authorial purpose in text, voice and narration, including little observations in the text that might come through the narrator. And then finally, that values piece. So with the values piece, I started my unit with this, and I've actually got an example on the next slide, but I'm going to pass to Avril first.
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention this framework that both Lachlan and I have kind of been thinking through as perhaps another way to just think about this unit, which is text to self, text to text, and text to world. And we'll talk about this in perhaps a little bit more depth a little bit later on. But basically, text to self is where a student would make connections between the text that you're studying and their personal experiences. Text to text is making connections between the text that you're studying and other texts. So that could be movies or songs or video games or TV shows or other books or novels that they might have studied earlier in their high school career. And text to world is making connections between the text that they're studying and the wider world or the wider society. So that might be current events or things that are happening in the news or have happened more historically.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce the text that I'm using in my class this year. So as I mentioned, it's The Tale of the Princess Kaguya, which is an anime film. The reason I chose this film actually came from a student I had in the past who said, like, why don't we teach any texts like from the Eastern sphere of thinking? And that really challenged me to think that actually a lot of the texts that I had been teaching didn't have a lot of personal connection with my students. And anime is certainly an area that my students really were interested in. And so when this unit was introduced, I wanted to make sure that the text I chose really spoke to the students in my class. So far, it's early days, but I've definitely had a lot to talk about with the students in terms of connecting to the text. Although the text is set in Japan and talks a lot about Japanese culture, there are a lot of similarities to things in China, and the students are able to make those connections in interesting ways. So I've got a little table here of some of the types of connections that I'm using in my class. The first one is about character. So Sutamaru and Kaguya, two of the characters. And this encourages students to think about some of the ways that characters are explored in the text in the film and how this might connect with their own experiences. The second part of the table there is around setting and thinking about how the main character, her experience changes quite drastically between the countryside and the capital, and how this might align with the student feeling quite different in different places, or if you have students who haven't had, they might not be students who EAL because they've come from another country, they might be hearing impaired, or Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander students, they might not have that same experience, but you could think of other ways that they could think about significant changes in their lives. And then that final piece is around that cultural, social, historical values. So in the text, one of the main character, Princess Kaguya, she struggles with the ideas of beauty standards in Japan. And so I'm encouraging students to have a think about how beauty standards and different expectations around that might be something that they've come up with in their life, come into contact with in their lives, and creating some connections there. And some activities that I'm using in class. I won't go through all of these, but I might focus on the top right about anime. So in order to sort of build the world of the film, we talked a lot about anime and some of the tropes that exist in anime. And that really exists within the, I suppose, the world of the text and the context of the film. And students were able to think about all the different anime texts that they've come into contact with and compare how this film adheres to those and make those connections to the different animes that they're familiar with.
So the text that I'm teaching for this unit is Lorinda by Alice Pung. We made this decision last year. It was a text that we were already teaching, so it was one that we're already really familiar with, that we know our students responded well with, because there's a lot of cultural similarities between the cohort of students we have who are mostly from a Vietnamese background and the main character of this novel. So there's a really clear kind of text to self connection there for our students. I think there's also lots of great text to text connections. It's a coming of age story, but it's very much kind of, a high school drama, lots of links with movies like Mean Girls or Heathers, if students are kind of familiar with that genre of film. And then also the text begins with an epigraph, which is a quote by Kurt Vonnegut, "Life is nothing but high school." So I think for students that we really want to kind of extend and challenge in this unit, there's some great connections to be made between kind of the idea of high school as sort of a metaphor for society as a whole. So similarly to Lachlan, I've gone through and found some examples and thought about how students might develop some of those connections between setting and character and values there. I did want to mention at this point that this is a text that we're finding has been a little bit more challenging than we expected, because we normally teach it in term 3 our students' vocab and language has developed a little bit more, and some of the expectations that we have around what Year 11 EAL looks like, they're more familiar with. And we're certainly finding that the complexity of some of the language is challenging some of our students. So we're really glad that we've got that option from the study design of using extracts from the set text so that we can support students as they go through the unit who might not be able to get through the whole text. It is a lengthy novel, so that gives us a really good option to make sure that all of our students are going to be able to meet this outcome. And then I've just selected some of the kind of introductory activities that we did with this unit just to share with you. So the first one there is to complete a ranking table. So something that I really like doing with EAL students is giving them a list of ideas or events or characters from a text and getting them just to rank them, because that still requires a lot of thinking skills and requires students to kind of think critically about the text without having to do any writing. So it can be a way to really engage thinking without having to go through that longer process of writing something down. But you can see from these slides that they do move from an activity like that to something like brainstorming, which does require them to jot down some ideas, to that activity on the final slide there, which you can see would require some longer or perhaps more sustained writing from students. But still, the idea is to get students to make some of those personal connections with the text and think about the similarities between themselves and characters. So I'm going to talk now about some classroom activities that you might use to support the teaching of the personal response. I'm going to move from kind of activities that you might run with your whole class to smaller groups and pairs, and finally some more individual activities. So the first one there is ranking lines and four-corner debates. So for me, I find it really useful to have something kind of in my toolkit that allows students to engage with the text that doesn't necessarily require them to respond orally or verbally or in writing, particularly early on in a unit and particularly at this point in the school year. So a ranking line is an activity where you would get students to line up from one side of the classroom to the other, and it generally needs to be something countable. So the one that I used initially with students was, how much of the book have you read? From all of it to none of it. That gives me a really clear indication of which students in the class I might need to support or perhaps challenge a little bit more early on. But you might also do a ranking line that has, rank how much you admire the main character from 1 to 10 and have 10 down one end and 1 down the other. Obviously, you can extend students to sharing with the students on either side of them, ask them to provide evidence for, why they've stood where they have, and that this kind of activity allows you to differentiate in that way. A four-corner debate is fairly similar, but you would have a strongly agree corner, an agree corner, a strongly disagree, and a disagree corner. And then you might have a prompt or an argument for students to, or a statement for students to think about, and then they need to place themselves in that corner. You can also have kind of the middle of the classroom as an I don't know yet, which gives students an opportunity to let you know that they're not sure about what that statement is, or they haven't read much of the text. I think that word yet is really important, and you can always then ask a follow-up question, which is, what information do you need in order to move into one of those four corners? The second activity is a round robin discussion. I also like to call this a speed dating activity. So the premise of this is that you would get students to line up in 2 lines facing one another, have one side as the agree side and the other side as disagree. Then I'd set a timer for EAL students, probably 2 minutes. And I would normally, the first few times I run this activity at least, allow them 15 seconds or 30 seconds of thinking time first, just to make sure that students have got something to say when you start that timer. So there's some prompts there for the text that we're studying. So the first one there is, Lorinda is a dangerous place. So all students speak at once. The side A begins. For 2 minutes, they talk about why Lorinda is a dangerous place. And then you stop the timer and then switch. So then the side B disagrees and they say why Lorinda is not a dangerous place. Then the idea with a round robin discussion is that the line then moves down one student, so that each student then has a new partner. You give them a new prompt, or if you feel like they still need to explore or kind of tease out ideas in that first prompt, you can run it again and share ideas with the next partner that they have. I really like doing any kind of activity that gets students to kind of verbally engage with one another in that low stakes way. I think it is a great way to run a discussion. It means that you can kind of listen into conversations and move down the line and listen in or support students where you need to. I also find it really helpful to use drama-based activities in the EAL classroom. So drama-based or embodied pedagogy activities, so anything that allows students to kind of get into the minds of characters a little bit more. This idea of a character hot seat is where you would have one student or a teacher that acts as a character. So in the text that we're studying, there's a character, Mrs. Leslie, who I think has a little bit of complexity, at least to her, and is a more minor character. So it might be an interesting one for students to think about a little bit more. So you have that student sitting in the hot seat, and then the rest of the students in the class interview or ask questions of that student as if they were the character. For EAL students, I'd certainly differentiate by either giving them time to write down some questions beforehand or some thinking time beforehand, or even putting some possible kind of sentence starters on the board. So even if you don't give them any time to write questions beforehand, they've got some sentence stems to begin with. You might need to model it beforehand to really make sure that you're getting high engagement from this. And then I'd always get students to do some kind of a reflection afterwards. How did it change their thinking, or what surprised them through the activity? This activity is called an interview table. So for this activity, students get an A4 piece of paper that has these questions on it, and you would obviously pick some questions that are relevant to the text that you're studying. So students need to interview 3 other students in the class. So in the left-hand column, they write down the name of the student that they're interviewing, and then underneath the 2 questions, they write down the other students' responses. I'd really encourage just dot point answers to this. It's a really great way to also build some note-making skills for students. And you can see that some of those questions are more challenging. Some of them are certainly more personal, and some are slightly more kind of analytical. So you can really use this to differentiate. If you use some kind of Kagan grouping or color coding in your classroom for differentiation, you could have the sheet of paper set up with that color coding already on it, so they know they have to ask a student who's color coded as green, something like that. If you need to differentiate further, the next step down is to use like a find someone who sheet. So this one you can differentiate again in kind of 2 different ways. The easiest option is just to have students find someone else in the class that can answer one of these questions or fits into one of these descriptors and write their name underneath. But you can make the questions a little bit more challenging as well. So you can see there one of them is that they can state 2 of the key themes of Lorinda. So if you were doing ones like that where you really need them to record an answer, or you think that's going to be more beneficial for them to record an answer, make sure that the student doing the asking or doing the interviewing is writing down the response. And then the other student who has answered the question signs their name underneath. So you kind of get both students to engage in it that way. I really like activities like this that get students to find out the information from other students, because it supports students who might be feeling a lack of confidence about the text, or feel like they don't have any ideas to share, because initially all you're asking them is to find out this information from somebody else, that they're not having to share their own information, and they still are kind of building that knowledge base through an activity like this. So we're going to move on to some small group and pair activities. So this one is a dinner plate activity. So this I would run as a small group activity. I'd have an A4 or actually probably an A3 piece of paper. You can easily set up text boxes on a Word document to flip around the text like this. So put this in the center of the table, and then the idea is that students jot down the answers to the questions in front of them, and then they rotate it around. So by the time they've gone through all 4 characters there on that sheet, they've got a real range of ideas and examples that they can then draw upon. Again, it's something that you can fairly easily differentiate. So you could have some questions that are set up, that are easier to respond to, or some of these characters are more major characters and some are minor characters. So the major characters are obviously going to be easier for students to kind of draw examples from quicker. So you can start with students that might need support, have those easier questions for them to answer first. And then you could ask them just to tick by the time they get to the 3rd or 4th time that it comes around to them. So they don't necessarily have to add on new ideas, but just tick the ideas that they think are the best ideas that the other students have already recorded. Turn and talks, I think are, a really important feature of any classroom, not just EAL classrooms, but I really like to use really clear structures for my students. So the example on the left is a think, ink, pair, share, where students have 30 seconds to think about a question, or to think about their response to a question, 2 minutes to then write it down, then to discuss it with a partner, and then another 2 minutes to discuss with a table group, or if you've got a small class, with the whole class. And then the one on the right is a turn and talk that I really like, where you get students to stand up. They take it in turns to answer a question, and they're not allowed to sit down until they've reached an agreement. If you have students who you think are going to sit down just as quickly as possible without coming to any kind of agreement, as I often do, you can reverse it. So you can say you have to stand up once you agree, or something like that, to kind of make sure that there's a kind of an easy out there for students. So make sure that the questions, sorry, Lachlan, that the questions that you've got there, you can start with something that's more personal and move into something more analytical. And then again, the kind of evidence that you're asking them to provide can be, a quote from the text, or it can just be something that they remember. And you could also make this kind of a text-to-text or a text-to-world question as well. What's a way that they can, some examples that they can draw from, their life outside of the text. Co-annotating is an activity I like to use fairly early on when I'm still trying to build some of those annotation skills with students. So you have one copy of the text per student. So you might like to photocopy and blow up a page from the text, or you might have students just highlighting and annotating in their own text. You can see that the examples on the left there are more personal, and the example in the orange there is perhaps a little bit more analytical. But the idea is that students would read the text together, ideally out loud, but it could be independently or taking it in turns. And then they're each looking for things, looking to identify, highlight, and then annotate different things in a text. And then they might share that with the class. But the idea is that they're kind of building their knowledge. Again, you can differentiate it by having, partner A having something more challenging. So instead of making personal connections to school life, it might be making personal connections to the societal values. And similarly with the one on the right there, you could have themes and characters as kind of an easier option, and then literary features or text structures as a more challenging option there. And then here are just some ideas for individual student activities. So you can obviously use lots of different graphic organizers. The one on the right is the one that you saw before. So that's where I'd have students jotting down examples from their personal experience, from other texts, and from the wider world that connect with the text that you're studying. I really like using sticky notes in class because I think, again, it's something that's kind of really low stakes for students to engage with. So anything that gets them to write down kind of one idea and then share it with other people. You can then use those kind of sticky notes to do kind of ranking activities or categorizing activities, get students to kind of pool ideas and then decide on the best ones and kind of throw out the ones that are less relevant or that they think are less good. Visual representation. So if you're getting students to kind of engage with quotes or, a particular part of the text, you might get them to draw a symbol or a small picture that visually represents that quote or that section of the text. And then as you're getting students to write, providing them with some sentence stems that really draw upon that kind of personal language that we want them to be using in the personal response. So you can see some examples of those in the box there.
Thanks, Avril. I feel like every time Avril talks about the things she's doing in her class, I learn something, and then I'm like, I'm going to use that in my class.
Oh, that's very generous. Thanks, Lachlan.
Yeah, as Avril was presenting through those learning ideas, it just reminded me of how timely and excellent this area is for us in our classrooms. I think with the recent news about ChatGPT and some of the advances in AI, really stressing personal responses for students, I think is going to be a really big win for us in the classroom. And I think this is going to be a really great area for us to discuss and learn with our students. So that brings us to assessment, which I'm going to go through with you now. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the differences between English and EAL is that you have the option to do a note form summary. Of course, you could use the note form summary as a learning tool, which I often do in my EAL classes, but it can also serve to meet the outcome for your students. I think that this would be something that you would do only if it was to differentiate for a student who required this step to meet the outcome. I think it's really good to encourage all students to produce an extended response, but having this as one option in your toolkit, I think is really great. So this comes from, for those of us who might remember a couple of study designs ago now, part of the end of year examination, the students were required to do a note form summary for their analysis of language and argument section of the exam. But it here might be something that you're using again for that idea of key connections between the student and the text, and of course text to text and text to world as well. So it would form a summary of those connections. Here you'd be of course focusing on the elements of text that you're studying in class, including those like characters, plot, and ideas. And the style of the note form summary, I think, it's really open. So already in my class, we've been using a lot of tables in order to sort of organize our connections, but you might like to use mind maps, Venn diagrams, dot points. Like there's lots of opportunities here, and it's just about visually presenting the information, not necessarily in that sort of more academic extended form, allowing students to convey their understanding, convey their connections, convey what they've learned through a more flexible style. And here, English, like syntax and the complexities of language are perhaps not as necessary. It's more just about demonstrating that understanding. I've got a little sample here for one of the stories from Growing Up Asian in Australia, or if you're using Growing Up in Australia, it's in that collection as well. So on the left, I've just jotted down a few of the key, what did I jot down here? A few of the key plot points from that story. And then on the other side, I've got a person who might be in the class and what they connect to in that story, but then the actual core of the connection is listed in the middle, finding our community with other like-minded people post-migration. And so that would be obviously maybe not the full text that a student might produce. And if you did want to see a more extended version of the note form summary, there's an example rather in the Insight EAL Year 11 textbook. So if you go in there, you'll see there's a quite extended example of what this might look like. Additionally, in assessment, you might want to consider using a reading, or in my case, and if you're using a film, a viewing journal. This can definitely be part of your assessment strategies in terms of it could maybe comprise a proportion of the final grade. And again, students are encouraged in their reading journal, perhaps, to be thinking about different things through the text to really document their reading experience. You might give them some prompts to think about character setting, plot, or maybe the values and ideas at different points, or you might just have some sort of more generic questions for them to guide them as they go through the text. And I think particularly in an EAL classroom, this is a really wonderful opportunity for students to also document and reflect on their vocabulary acquisition. So as they're going through, they might be sort of annotating words that are unfamiliar to them, and there might be keywords to the text, and they could add those to their journal as they go through. And that can be something, they're really gaining that through the text, and then that forms part of the journal. For my holiday homework, I sort of gave a sort of quite simple version of a viewing journal where students were required to watch the film twice. The first time they were asked a series of sort of quite basic questions, including a focus on text elements. And then I asked them to watch the film a second time, and I increased the level of sophistication in what I was requiring from them, including how some of their initial impressions of the film may have changed, and having a think about why that might have occurred. Why might our viewing of a film change the second time we see it? In addition, I asked them to think more about quotations and documenting things in more detail that second time. So yeah, definitely something you can also include as part of your assessment strategies. And then finally, of course, the more extended personal writing piece. This is definitely what I'm going to be doing with my class at the end of the unit. And it will be a summative assessment that they'll do in class. And this is an extended piece of writing. And I wanted to go through some of the details that I'm going to be encouraging my students to use. Certainly, they'll be using first-person pronouns, which of course, I know we're normally very hesitant to let students use first-person pronouns in their essays because they're banned. And the idea of introducing this, I think, can feel a little bit scary because we're opening the floodgates, and then maybe we're going to end up with personal pronouns in every piece of writing that they produce. But I think it's important to remember the second area of study is going to be around crafting texts. And again, there's going to be opportunity for them to explore personal experiences and things. And so I think it's important that we teach the text typing context and say what we can do here. And then separately, and Avril will cover this a bit later as well, when we talk about the bridge with analytical writing, we can be really deliberate and explicit in saying that what you were doing in the personal response stays there, and now we're doing a different task. I'll still very much be using paragraph and teaching paragraphing. I think even though we're talking about personal responses and there's some levels of like, it's less perhaps academic in some ways, perhaps, I still think it's important that they're using paragraphs and we're teaching paragraph structure. And in my class, I'll certainly be making it idea-based paragraphs. As a part of this area of study, it's important that students are still using text evidence, including quotations, and beyond the inclusion of those, it's important they're also using the appropriate meta language. So this is all very familiar territory from when we teach text response. So those elements are still included in a personal response. I wanted to go through a few examples of what the prompts might look like, and I sort of categorize them in three ways. The first one, and I've seen a lot of examples of these floating around in some of the forums and areas where people are sharing their ideas, are really quite open prompts, really encouraging, like sort of giving students a lot of choice. So here I've got select a character from the text and describe the development, establish a personal connection to this development, identifying similarities and or differences. So that's very open. I think it gives students a lot of choice, which could be good for some classes, but it also might be a bit too much choice for others. So a more directed option might look like this, giving students a little bit more of a focus here in terms of something that happens in the story and how this might connect with something in their world. And then finally, I thought I'd include one in more of a traditional essay style, including using the prompt discuss, which we're familiar with. I'll give you a moment to have a look at that one. So I think it's up to you as to what kind of prompt you wish to use in your class, but I just wanted to give you a few options so that you can see what that might look like. I plan to give my students 2 options as we would normally, so that they've got a bit of choice. And yeah. So I'm going to pass back over to Avril to talk about how you might move forward to thinking about analytical writing.
Thanks, Lachlan. Yeah, so I hope that you've seen, as we've kind of been going through, there are lots of ways that we've already kind of drawn upon some of the skills that you would naturally teach in any like text response unit, and that there's a real overlap in the kinds of skills that we're expecting of students to demonstrate in their final pieces of assessment. So I did just want to look quickly back at the study design. I just have drawn out some things from the key knowledge and key skills that I think kind of really hone in on some of the analytical things that VCAR is expecting us to teach in this unit. And you can see that there's an expectation that students are doing personal and analytical writing. So even though this is a personal response unit, there's still an expectation that students are practicing their analytical writing skills, across the course of the unit and showing that in their final outcome. So I won't read through all of those, but yeah, that's there as kind of, I guess, the starting point for you when you're thinking about this. For me, the way that I begin by introducing some of this analytical writing in the unit would be through the skill of close reading. So Lachlan pointed out before that, the teaching of appropriate meta-language or the usage of appropriate meta-language. Unit 2 kind of really hones in on some of those, on that skill in particular, I think, with a much more narrow focus on text structures and features. But that's certainly something that's in this part of this area of study as well. So teaching students that meta-language and finding some kind of, I guess, easy or accessible examples for students to look at in the text that you're studying. Then asking students to identify specific words or phrases or lines in the text that reveal the author's purpose or reveal characterization, and providing sentence stems or scaffolds for students to write about these examples, and keeping initially analytical writing short. We're doing, as one of our kind of first formative tasks, a passage analysis, because we really want our students to get good at this skill of close reading, as well as building, their personal response. I think you might have skipped a slide there. Oh no, I'm one ahead. Yeah, so these are just some slides that we used early on in our unit. And you can see again the way that we've kind of moved from providing students with some kind of ideas about the text and some directed or guided questions to giving them kind of a list of particular elements or ideas that they're going to select from before giving them some sentence frames to start doing some analytical writing about. So that's really scaffolded and structured, but there's a real sense of kind of a development of skill there. Secondly, I think the thing that we're asking students to do across the course of this unit is develop an interpretation. So in this unit, that's really about developing a personal interpretation of the text, but that skill is also really important in Unit 2. So we're encouraging students to form their opinion about the text and then support those opinion statements with evidence. And you can do that in a personal way or a more analytical way. So getting students to practice in both of those senses, I think, is really important. The kinds of interpretations that we're expecting of them in Unit 2, to be able to, say that a character, has success in a novel or should be admired or should be condemned or, acted justly. All of those things, you can draw upon those in this personal response unit as well, and begin to teach those skills. And then finally, giving them lots of opportunities to practice analytical writing. So providing them with lots of models, whether those are ones that you've come up with yourself or from textbooks. Lachlan mentioned ChatGPT and the world of AI. I think that as teachers is really exciting in taking off some of the mental load for us about coming up with some models, and particularly for EAL students, I think, because at the moment, at least, the AI generated responses are kind of quite middle range in lots of senses. So that's probably a good, point to pitch it for EAL students. And then using kind of an I do, we do, you do framework where you as the teacher model it, do it together as a class before students are, individually doing it, that gradual release of responsibility. And then finally, something that I really try and build in my own class is a culture of feedback. So looking at individual responses as a whole class. So I often take a photo of students' work if they're handwriting it, and then add it to my PowerPoint slide and project it for students to look at. But you can also do that by, using lots of online tools as well. So if students are working on a Google Doc, you can obviously have access to that and project it, or something like Socrative if students are just doing kind of an exit ticket style thing where they might be writing some analytical sentences. So using those genuine student examples and getting students to look at those and be able to critique it and say what's working well and what students their peers might need to work on is a really good way of kind of giving feedback and allowing students to kind of develop those analytical skills. And then finally, just thinking about how you might kind of build some analytical writing skills into your assessment. So as I mentioned, we're using one of our formative tasks as an opportunity to develop those analytical skills. You might also include, a couple of criteria around analytical skills in your assessment rubrics when you're developing your personal response assessment tasks. And then I know that there's lots of schools that are using the mid-year exam as an opportunity to kind of move away from the personal response and back towards more traditional text response essays. Lachlan, I don't know if you wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, so at our school, we're planning to do this in both English and EAL. So our plan is to have about a week or two before the mid-year examination when we'll return to the text that we use for personal response. And we'll draw on all of the rich discussion we had on all the text elements, but then teach the students to use that text for a traditional text response essay. And I think that now brings us to the Q&A.
Yeah, and I can see there's 2 questions already in our Q&A. Or did you want to go, Jess?
Absolutely. So we've got 20 minutes, so keep the questions coming, everybody. Well, we've got 17 minutes now, so let's see how many we can get in. I'll start with one, though, which is, Avril, you were mentioning about teaching meta-language. Can you give some examples of some meta-language that you think might help students sort of keep that differentiation between the personal and the analytical?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one, that fits kind of probably more under analytical. So when I think about meta language, I think about kind of text structures and features. So anything that might count as kind of a literary technique, so metaphors and similes and personification. In the text that we're looking at, we're also looking a lot at Alice Pung's use of humor and how that kind of might how students might be able to analyze that. So I would introduce a term to a student, give them some examples of it in the text. And then if I'm teaching it like analytically, I would explain how I might analyze that in a sentence, and then get students to find their own examples and analyze it, practice analyzing it themselves. Lachlan, I don't know if you wanted to expand on that or how you might teach that differently.
Yeah, do you have
just to add?
Sorry, go on.
Sorry, Jess.
They're all good.
Just to add that in my class, we're doing film. So when we do scene analyses, we're going to be looking at the meta language of discussing how film's constructed, including things like shot types. It's not going to be the main focus of what we do. And I suppose that might be the difference between what we're doing here, is that I'll be using that language somewhat, but it's not going to be something that I'm going to be stressing as the main focus. But I will expect, particularly my high-end students, higher achieving students, to be using that language in their responses.
And I'll just follow that up with, it was an issue that came up sort of yesterday with sort of, to what extent should the personal response also be analytical? Because I mean, it still has to be some kind of critical response, not just an immediate reaction. Lachlan, what are your thoughts? And then I'll pass to you, Avril.
I think the task is analytical by nature. So what they're writing is, in a sense, they're still getting a prompt, and they're still sort of unpacking and brainstorming from that prompt, and then required to bring examples from the text in addition to those text to self, text to text, text to world examples. So I think what we are doing is still analytical writing. It's just analytical writing with personal elements. So in a way, it's not the traditional text response essay, but it's still a type of analytical writing. And what I think is really exciting is that quite often what we do in VCE starts to dictate what we do all the way down through the years into year 7. I know many schools take that sort of approach. And I think looking at different ways to respond to text rather than just a text response essay, I think is really fabulous and a really good place for us to be moving, so that we can start to do really more exciting and different things in the younger year levels with text, rather than always perhaps doing the same type of writing.
Avril, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I would agree with Lachlan in terms of what we're expecting, I guess, of most of our students in that final assessment task. I think for me, the thing that I really appreciate about this study design is that the outcome itself is really accessible for students. So if you have students where, traditionally in Unit 1, you might have really struggled to find enough evidence to pass them, I think the way that the study design is written, because of that focus on the personal response, gives some of those students really kind of something to hang on to meet the outcome. So yeah, where we're still kind of expecting the top end probably of our kind of the high performing students to kind of achieve the same. There's perhaps a little bit more space kind of for students who are struggling, particularly EAL students, to think about, okay, well, let's worry less about the analytical. How are you kind of personally responding or personally connecting to this text?
Fantastic. And we've just had one come in. Do you have any ideas of how you would prepare the personal response for year 10s as well, coming into year 11 next year? Avril, I'll go to you first.
It's something that we talked about last year, and at our school we haven't done any preparation, so we've kind of just assumed that the discussions that students are having, like in a year 10 classroom, probably you begin quite naturally with trying to get students to personally respond to a text, and that we were fairly happy that, or satisfied that we could kind of build on kind of what the actual task itself might look like at year 11. But certainly I think having opportunities for students to do some personal writing, so do some reflective writing, or have some of those kind of small group activities that I suggested. I think they work well in year 10 in any kind of unit, regardless of if your final assessment task is going to be a text response essay or something more personal. I think about the text that you're teaching and allowing students, access to texts that do, really allow for that text to self connection.
What about you, Lachlan?
Something I'd add there is that if we're thinking about moving this down into lower year levels, one area that could be really interesting is giving students around the text. So if we're wanting students to create a personal connection, but we're not moving into that more academic space of the VCE, perhaps we could even let students choose their own text, which I think would be really fun, because then they're really going to be able to achieve those personal responses. And in the types of writing that we're expecting from them, whether that be a personal response or finding even other ways to start to access text on a different level, I think it's really a great opportunity to have less rigidly structured writing for students, And so it might be that you are sort of scaffolding these skills down in a way that students are really encouraged to write, just like, I don't want to say stream of consciousness because that's dangerous, but moving into more of a space where students are encouraged to write without as much constraint around what, giving some, but a little bit more freedom in the way that they write. I think that's a really something that could be really beneficial to students, particularly EAL students.
And you were just mentioning structure there, and we've got a question about structure. It says, can I ask the speakers to expand on how they intend to structure their personal response paragraphs? Will you do an intro and conclusion? How many paragraphs? Our English EAL team is a bit unclear on how to structurally approach the extended response. So Avril, I'll go to you first for that one.
Yeah, we have not decided yet in our team. We're kind of still building our final assessment task. I think that's the nature of this unit the first time around. I think we're going to stick with something that's pretty traditional with an introduction and a conclusion. Probably only 2 paragraphs, I think, for our cohort of students at this stage, only because we're really finding that the cohort that we've got is really struggling with that kind of sustained writing. And yeah, I think the structure of the paragraph that we're looking at would be something like make a connection to the text, give a personal example, give another example from the text, and kind of maybe analyze the example from the text a little bit before then adding in some more personal examples. So kind of moving between almost analysis, personal example, analysis, personal example.
Yeah, I'd really mirror what Avril just said. I'd also mention that in the Insight textbook, there's a sample personal response, and it has an introduction, a conclusion, and 2 body paragraphs. So that is probably a popular way of going about the extended response. I think similarly, I want them to still learn about topic sentences and really introduce their paragraphs with a really clear idea. And then, yeah, alternating between whether it's a personal, whether it's obviously the text example, but then whether it's a personal response, or also if they've got the ability to do text to text or text to world, I think introducing those as well. For me, those text to text and text to world examples, I'll be pushing more to my high achieving students, and sort of focusing just on those personal responses for the majority of my class.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to say that that's certainly what we're doing, and I'm teaching Year 11 English as well, and that is like, I think their English team, like as a whole, is really expecting English students to be making text to text and text to world connections and less text to self. So I think we're probably going to see that that way of kind of differentiating between higher achieving students and lower achieving students in this unit.
Now, we've got one here about a traditional text response. So if you're returning to traditional text response in the mid-year exam, would you still allow students to make some personal connections within their argument, for example, in a conclusion? Lachlan, what are your thoughts there?
The short answer would be no. I think I'm going to be really strict when I get to the mid-year exam around we're now doing the text response essay, and I don't want to have any crossover or confusion there. I think it is, I feel it's important to include it in the mid-year exam because I want them to have that sort of ability to choose between 2 texts as well at the end of the year, and just limiting it to one. I think, yeah, it's important they get a choice. In the conclusion, I've always taught students in a standard text response that they're able to make sort of a link to something bigger or some bigger idea. And so I think that might sort of fit what the question's sort of asking, but I think I would probably I wouldn't ask for a personal connection or any first person discussion there.
So definitely avoiding muddying those waters between the 2 different types of writing, I suppose.
Exactly. Yeah. I'd be careful.
Yeah.
I have a slightly, well, I guess my opinion is slightly different because I think it's like one of my things that I think is really important is on our mid-year exam that we're assessing the work that students have done in that semester. So I really want to privilege the work on the personal response, and we'll be assessing the personal response on the exam rather than kind of introducing text response at that point. So we'll, that will be another opportunity for students to use their personal response skills on the exam. So it'll be a pretty similar task to what their final assessment task is for this unit.
Now, we've got one here. As there are personal responses, if a student is writing personal connections to text, how do you avoid issues of a student disclosing sensitive personal information? Avril, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an issue regardless of whether you're kind of focusing in on the personal response. I think that's something as teachers that we always kind of have to manage, particularly in an English or an EAL classroom, where you might be, talking about issues that are really relevant to students, as opposed to something like maths. I would just make sure that you set really clear boundaries at the beginning of, each lesson. Think about the text that you're teaching and the kinds of questions that you're asking. Where in English, we're teaching Medea as a personal response text. And some of the things that I'm finding really challenging in kind of formulating some of those questions that we're asking, there's a lot about kind of anger and grief in there. And some of the questions that you might have seen or that you saw on the slides earlier were around, if you have experienced this, how might you have responded? And I really don't want, particularly at this point in the unit, to be eliciting that information from students. So I think just thinking about the types of questions that you're asking them, and focus kind of less on things that you think are going to be particularly confronting for students, I guess. And then making sure that you've got, I guess, a really good process at your school for what happens if a student does disclose that personal information. I think treat it as a positive that student, if it's, either in a whole class or one-on-one, has felt comfortable to share that with you, I think is, a positive.
That also sort of links to another question somebody sent in, which how do you handle having students connecting to a text that features mature and challenging themes such as racism or poverty? Lachlan, how would you be managing that?
Again, I think I would reiterate what Avril said in terms of text choice. I think the text that we choose, I think we really direct the discussion and the connections that they're going to be making. So if there are things to do with poverty or racism, we just guide them in a way that's going to be really relevant to the task and allow them to do things in a safe way. And I think that if students are having those connections with the text, the sort of model I use with the way we do text selection is that I forget the researchers who came up with it, so sorry for lacking a citation, but this is the idea of texts are a mirror to our own experiences. Text can be a window into something that we haven't experienced, and they can also be a sliding door to help us move forwards in our own lives, and it can help us develop. And I think that that's a really powerful and wonderful thing that we can share with students. So if it is something that mirrors their experience or helps them move forwards perhaps in dealing with some of their trauma, I think that's a really privileged and wonderful thing that we can do. And that's one of the wonderful things about being a teacher of English.
Now we've just got a little time left, so I'm going to ask this one, which was also an issue that came up yesterday as well. Is it okay for a student to say that they do not feel connected to the text, to say that they have nothing that resonates with them? Avril, what are your thoughts?
I would dispute that a student can find no connections with a text, but what I would focus on there is the differences. So I'd say, okay, if you feel really differently from this character, what is that difference for you, and get them to connect in that way? What is the kind of point of difference or the tension there for that student that they have? But I just brainstorm. Hopefully as you keep going through the unit, you'll see students will be sharing lots of different examples, and you can kind of keep those moments or relatable or moments of personal connection as small as you like, or as a teacher you can do that work of really abstracting it to a point where there's something that a student can connect with. And obviously it's difficult at this point in the year because we're still getting to know our students, but the more that you build those relationships with your students, the more you'll be able to kind of think about some things that they might be able to personally connect with and suggest those to the students.
There was also sort of related, because I think perhaps a student might say that if maybe they don't feel that their own personal sort of connection with something or their own personal experiences are maybe interesting enough or are too mundane for this kind of task. Lachlan, how would you sort of combat that thinking?
I want to give you a bit of background. So in my class, I've told you I've chosen this film, The Tale of Princess Kaguya. It's about a female protagonist. A lot of it's about gender. My class has 15 boys in it and 3 girls. And I instantly thought to myself, I wonder how they're going to go with that connection to the female experience. And that's something I'm really leaning into in the class. And so I haven't really gotten into many of those themes in detail yet. So I'm yet to see how that's going to play out. I haven't had any sort of like, feedback on it yet. But I think that something that's important is that there's still, even if they're perhaps not personally connecting to it, we've still got those text-to-text connections and text-to-world connections that they're able to draw on as well. And just like Avril said, I think talking about how your experience is different to that character and exploring that could even be like, that's a really interesting space to navigate, and can be quite sophisticated. So something to explore.
Fantastic. Well, we're just in the last minute of this seminar. So Avril and Lachlan, thank you both so much for your wonderful presentation. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Avril and Lachlan, and have a fantastic evening.